It is July 1st, 1969, the very first day of the Abbey Road recording sessions. But John Lennon is not there. He is currently at a petrol station near the village of Tongue in Scotland, and being John, he cannot go anywhere without signing a few autographs. And after he does so, he climbs into the driver's seat of his car. Next to him, of course, is Yoko Ono, and in the back seat sit both John's son Julian and Yoko's daughter Kyoko. He pulls out of the station. The weather is poor, rainy and foggy. Now, John has always been a poor driver, let alone for the fact that for about 6 years now he's been chauffeured just about everywhere he goes. He only received his driver's license in 1965, and since then has only driven locally near his home in Weybridge. They drive upon a remote single-track road. Suddenly, in the distance, approaches another vehicle, driven by a German tourist. On a single-track road such as this, the rules state that both cars should come to a stop and each try to find a suitable place in which to pull over to allow the other to pass. It seems, though, that neither driver is aware of this rule. The cars accelerate toward each other, and in a moment of dumb panic, John simply takes his hands off of the wheel. The car swerves violently, and then rolls into a ditch. The impact of the crash causes the occupants' heads to whip forward, causing facial injuries and rendering them briefly unconscious from the force of the blow. The only one spared, miraculously it seems, was Julian, who was sitting on the floor well behind Yoko. The car came to a stop. 6-year-old Julian crawled out of the vehicle while the others sat unresponsive. He began to cry. The other vehicle kept driving. Not too long after, in a stroke of luck, someone spotted the crashed vehicle, and after checking on them, dashed off to a nearby farm where they phoned for an ambulance. Due to the remoteness of the location, it took an hour to arrive. They were taken to the Lawson Memorial Hospital where John was given 17 facial stitches, Kyoko 4, and Yoko 14 stitches in her forehead, as well as injuring her back. Little Julian was not injured. John and Yoko spent 5 days in the hospital. Yoko took the brunt of the crash and was also pregnant at the time, so there was extra care taken to ensure her health. Cynthia, John's ex-wife, came quickly to pick up Julian and found that he had already been picked up by John's aunt, Mater. On Cynthia's arrival, John refused to see her. Then soon after, Yoko's ex-husband, Anthony Cox, came to get Kyoko. It was now just John and Yoko alone. And so, on July 1st, Paul was the only Beatle present as he recorded the first lead vocal for You Never Give Me Your Money. Also present was George Martin, who for the most part had decided he no longer wanted to work with the group. The White Album sessions were fraught and full of conflict, and the Let It Be sessions were even more of a disaster. So he was surprised when Paul rang him up and said, "We want to make another record. Will you produce it for us? Really produce it?" And George Martin said, "Yes, if I am really allowed to produce it." And thank goodness he did.
Once there was a way.
So as many of you may know, Paul's home was quite literally less than a 10-minute walk from EMI Studios. And because of this, he was almost always the first there and always got right to work. And so, alone in the studio, Paul decided to record a short little ditty called Her Majesty. Paul had it finished in 3 takes. When George and Ringo arrived, they began work on another Paul track, this one inspired by prose he had read in a book of children's nursery rhymes, Golden Slumbers. The original words were written all the way back in the 16th century by playwright Thomas Dekker. Here's Paul. I was playing the piano in Liverpool in my dad's house, and my stepsister Ruth's piano book was up on the stand. I was flicking through it and I came to Golden Slumbers. I can't read music and I couldn't remember the old tune, so I just started playing my own tune to it. I liked the words, so I kept them, and it fitted with another bit of song I had. This last line suggests that he had already composed Carry That Weight, and so put this song together to serve as its companion piece. So it was not only Golden Slumbers that they recorded, but Carry That Weight as well, considered here as one song rather than two. This was another song that reflected Paul's emotional turmoil at this time. We were entering a period in the mid to late 60s when we were doing LSD, staying up all night, then wishing it would wear off, discovering it wouldn't. A bad trip could leave you feeling a bit heavy instead of enjoying the normal lightness of youth. That was coupled with the business problems at Apple Records, which really were horrible. The business meetings were just soul-destroying. We'd sit around in an office, and it was a place you just didn't want to be, with people you didn't want to be with. There's a great picture that Linda took of Alan Klein, in which he's got a hammer, like Maxwell's silver hammer. It's very symbolic. They spent the next couple of days working on overdubs. And when they came in the next week, they would begin work on what would become one of the band's most popular songs going forward. Here Comes the Sun was written by George in Eric Clapton's garden. Here's George. Here Comes the Sun was written at the time when Apple was getting like school, where we had to go and be businessmen. Sign this and sign that. Anyway, it seems as if winter in England goes on forever. By the time spring comes, you really deserve it. So one day I decided I was going to sag off Apple, and I went over to Eric Clapton's house. The relief of not having to go and see all those dopey accountants was wonderful, and I walked around the garden with one of Eric's acoustic guitars and wrote Here Comes the Sun. Are you all noticing a recurring theme in the songs of this album? Today also marked a couple of other notable events. First off, Ringo's 29th birthday. I hope they had cake for him in the studio. And secondly, John's first non-Beatles single was released, Give Peace a Chance, under the name Plastic Ono Band. Oh no, what is that sound? Dread it, run from it. There is no escaping Maxwell's silver hammer. The song actually has a long history. It began all the way back in 1966 when Paul turned on the radio.
With the radio on, and there was this play that caught my ear, Zulu Kaku. I really liked it.
The play was described as a pataphysical extravaganza, and those words stuck in Paul's head for some years.
John was quizzical, studied pataphysical science in the home.
The song was actually written sometime in early 1968. In fact, it was very nearly recorded as a last-second addition to the White Album. Then it was rehearsed during the Let It Be sessions. But never yet had it been recorded until this day, the same day that John and Yoko returned following their car accident. The others waited in the studio for John and Yoko's arrival. There was a tension in the air, as if they were almost scared to see what John was like at this moment. But when he arrived, he seemed to be in good enough spirits. But where was Yoko? Suddenly, as the engineering team was setting up mics, a double-wide mattress was brought into the studio. An ambulance arrived outside, and Yoko was carried in and softly lowered onto the mattress. Then John requested a mic be set up above her, just in case she wanted to participate. Engineer Ron Richards walked into the scene, and in disbelief, walked up to John. "What the bloody hell is all this?" According to Richards, John was very touchy about it, so he quickly dropped the subject. Nonetheless, double-wide mattress or not, recording went on, as they recorded 21 takes of Maxwell's Silver Hammer on this day. They spent the last couple of hours overdubbing guitars. Today, an anvil was brought in for Ringo, just as they had done for Mal Evans some months earlier. They overdubbed piano, and a guitar played through a Leslie speaker, a technique that George loved to utilize during these sessions. Then they overdubbed Paul's lead vocal. 13 remixes were performed at the end of the session, suggesting that the song was considered finished. That was not to be the case, as the next day, they came in and recorded even more overdubs for Maxwell's. Now, this song has a reputation of being an absolute nightmare to record, with multiple incidents of the other Beatles complaining.
Maxwell Silverhair.
Oh, that's Paul's. I hate it. Because all I remember is the track. He made us do it 100 million times. He did everything to make it into a single, and it never was, and it never could have been. But he put guitar licks on it, and he had Mal hitting iron pieces, and we spent more money on that song than on the whole album, I think.
But as far as I can tell from the studio notes, this song was not half the ordeal to record that Obla Di Obla Da was, the other song that lives in infamy due to Paul's perfectionism. It is worth noting that a little over 2 whole days were devoted wholly to the song, or put another way, around 17 hours of recording work, which does sound maddening. And since we are talking tension, now would be a good time to share a very well-known story, that of Yoko Ono and her theft of George Harrison's McVitie's digestive biscuit. One fateful day, George stepped out of the studio and into the control room, leaving behind on the Leslie speaker cabinet his biscuit, and it was there, from the control room, that he saw Yoko rise from her bed, walk over, take, and begin eating his biscuit. This would lead to a shouting match between George and John, where the time came for them to finally air out all of their pent-up frustrations with each other. The entirety of the next week would be spent on overdubs for existing rhythm tracks. Some examples being the harmonium for Here Comes the Sun, as well as many of the fun sound effects for Octopus's Garden, including the sound of Ringo blowing bubbles in a cup of water. All the while, Paul kept coming in early every single day and attempting the lead vocal for Oh Darling.
When you told me you didn't need me anymore, well, you know, I nearly broke down and cried.
Engineer Alan Parsons recalls, he'd come in, sing it, and say, "No, that's not it. I'll try it again tomorrow." He only tried it once per day. I suppose he wanted to try and capture a certain rawness, which could only be done once before the voice changed. I remember him saying, 5 years ago I could have done this in a flash. So far to this point, John had kept a low profile in the studio and seemed to still be in a dry spell. But on Monday, he came back with a vengeance with his song, Come Together. In remembrance of the song, John was uncharacteristically positive. The only other song of his I've heard him speak so highly of was Happiness is a Warm Gun.
And Come Together was an expression that Leary and Rosemary had come up with for his attempt at being president or whatever he wanted to be.
What John and Yoko are doing here, what the kids are doing in Berkeley, planting trees in the park, and what we're doing in our campaign for governor is part of this great movement, a revulsion against the old-fashioned politics.
And they'd asked me to write them a single, a song, a campaign song. And I tried and I tried and I tried and I couldn't come up with it. But I came up with this Come Together, which would have been no good to, they couldn't have a campaign song like that, right? So I wrote another little thing called Come Together and Join the Party, Come Together and Join the Party. And it never got further than that, and they never came back to ask for the song. But I know Leary attacked me years later saying I ripped him off. I didn't rip him off. I had it there waiting for him. It's just that it turned into Come Together. What am I going to do, give it to him?
Really?
It's one of my favorite Beatles tracks. It's funky, it's bluesy, and I'm singing it pretty well.
This campaign of Leary's was abruptly ended when he was arrested for cannabis possession. When Leary eventually heard the Beatles' recording of the song, originally intended for his campaign, he was a bit bewildered. Although the new version was certainly a musical and lyrical improvement on my campaign song, I was a bit miffed that Lennon had passed me over this way. When I sent a mild protest to John, he replied with typical Lennon charm and wit that he was a tailor and I was a customer who had ordered a suit and never returned, so he sold it to someone else. There is of course some controversy surrounding this song, as it borrowed its opening line from Chuck Berry's "You Can't Catch Me."
Yeah, come on, flat top. He was moving up with me, then come.
John was sued by Berry's publisher, Morris Levy, and settled out of court. One of the stipulations of the settlement, somewhat funnily, was that John record more songs owned by Levy as a way to generate revenue for the publisher. The result was his 1975 album, Rock and Roll, which contained Berry's Sweet Little 16 and You Can't Catch Me. Take one of the song was extremely simple and terrific for it. John played no instrument as he simply sang and delivered a signature, biting vocal, clapping his hands together after each "shoot me" he sang. So begins work on one of the more collaborative Beatle tracks of the past few years, at this point called Ending, soon to be renamed The End. This would turn out to be a truly special day in the studio, and one full of novelties yet unseen in a Beatles recording. A Ringo drum solo, and a trio of guitar solos. The thing that always amused me was how much persuasion it took to get Ringo to play that solo. Usually, you have to try to talk drummers out of doing solos. He didn't want to do it, but everybody said, no, it'll be fantastic. So he gave in and turned in a bloody marvelous performance. It took a while to get right, and I think Paul helped with some ideas, but it's fantastic. I always want to hear it more. That's how good it is. It's so musical. It's not just a drummer going off. In the 7 takes they recorded, the style of drum solo changed every single time, showing that Ringo never had any particular plan in place. He simply went off the cuff, with some ideas from Paul, if Emmerich is correct in saying so. And then in recollection of the dueling guitar solos, Emmerich would say, "The idea for guitar solos was very spontaneous, and everybody said, yes, definitely." Well, except for George, who was a little apprehensive at first, but he saw how excited John and Paul were, so he went along with it. Truthfully, I think they rather liked the idea of playing together, not really trying to outdo one another per se, but engaging in some real musical bonding. Yoko was about to go into the studio with John, and he actually told her, "No, not now. Let me just do this. It'll just take a minute." That surprised me a bit. Maybe he felt he was returning to his roots with the boys. Who knows? And the magic seemed to rub off even further, as at the end of the day, after toiling away for weeks, Paul gave the lead vocal for "Oh Darling" another go. And it was on this day he would record his brilliant final attempt.
Oh, Johnny, please.
George is getting silly, George. Sir, George is getting silly.
Despite finally nailing the elusive vocal for "Oh Darling," Paul still arrived early the next day for one particular reason: to record a demo of a song he had written to be given to the group Badfinger. The song was named "Come and Get It." And this was not just a simple demo. Paul took the time to overdub an entire rhythm track and would end up producing Badfinger's own version of the song. Good work, Paul. Once the day really began, they got to work on a couple of John contributions to the medley, Sun King and Mean Mr. Mustard. Much like Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight, they were not recorded as 2 separate tracks, but as a continuous one, which in this particular example actually surprised me, just due to how different sounding the 2 songs are. The hypnotic guitar passage that opens the song was influenced by Fleetwood Mac's Albatross. At the time, Albatross was out with all the reverb on guitar. So we said, let's be Fleetwood Mac doing Albatross. It never really sounded like Fleetwood Mac, but that was the point of origin. The song eventually descends into a strange string of nonsense Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, with the odd English phrase thrown in. When we came to sing it, to make them different, we started joking, saying cuando para mucho. We just made it up. Paul knew a few Spanish words from school, so we just strung any Spanish words that sounded vaguely like something. Mean Mr. Mustard was a song written by John in India, and was another song considered for inclusion on the White Album. The song actually has its roots from back in 1967 when John read in the Daily Mirror an article about a miserly old man named John Alexander Mustard who had been taken to divorce court by his wife on account of his meanness.
I'd read somewhere in the newspaper about this mean guy who, something about hiding £5 notes, not up his nose but somewhere else. And it has nothing to do with cocaine or snorting.
They ended up recording 35 takes of the songs.
She came in through the bathroom window.
And now on Friday, another 2 songs recorded as one. Paul's She Came In Through the Bathroom Window and John's Polythene Pam. Let's hear first from Paul. I'm still amused by the distinction of a woman who could steal, but she could not rob. A nice distinction if there ever was one. And that, of course, goes back to the fact that a woman did actually sneak into my house through the bathroom window that was a bit ajar. A fan, apparently, one of a group called the Apple Scruffs. She found a ladder lying outside my home in London. As far as I recall, she stole a picture of my cotton salesman dad, or robbed me of it, but I got the song in return. In an anecdote by devoted Apple Scruff Margot Bird, she claims that these break-ins into Paul's house were not even that unusual. There were really 2 groups of Apple Scruffs, those who would break in and those who would just wait outside with cameras and autograph books. I used to take Paul's dog for a walk and got to know him quite well. The line, "And so I quit the police department," was inspired quite serendipitously by an unusual name that Paul spotted. Following a visit to Linda Eastman in late 1968, Paul was escorted back to JFK Airport, where he saw his driver's identification on the dashboard panel. It read, "Eugene quits, New York Police Department." Now what about Polythene Pam, another John song written in India? Will he call it a piece of garbage too? He actually refrained this time, as he seems to find humor in the origin of this song. The inspiration dates all the way back to 1960, with the band's acquaintance with beat poet Royston Ellis.
Crawling round the darkness of the ceiling.
Let's hear it from John.
That was me remembering a little event with a woman in Jersey, an island off the French coast which belongs to English, and a man called Roy something, who was England's answer to Allen Ginsberg. He was a beatnik that looked like a beatnik, and he came, and there weren't any jazz groups, there was only the Beatles, so it was the first rock and roll and poetry. He read poetry and we played blues, and he mentioned this in the paper. Years later he had a job in Jersey TV. I met him when we were big and on tour, and he took me back to his apartment. I had a girl and he had one that he'd said, "You want to meet her? Polythene Pam, she dresses up in polythene," which she did, in polythene bags. And yeah, well, it was kind of, perverted sex in a polythene bag. There was nothing really much to it.
The first 2 days of the next week were spent on overdubs for Polythene Pam, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, Come Together, and Sun King / Mean Mr. Mustard. When they came into the studio on the 30th, the goal was clear: to stitch together a rough draft of what the Beatles were currently calling the long one, aka the medley. Not all the songs were in a finished state. For example, the end did not yet have vocals, but the idea was to see how everything fit together, what needed fixing and what didn't. And there was one song in particular that Paul thought didn't work: Her Majesty. The song was initially placed between Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam.
Majesty's pretty nice. Someday I'm gonna make her mine.
Engineer John Kurlander tells the story. We did all the remixes and crossfades to overlap the song. Paul was there, and we heard it together for the first time. He said, "I don't like Her Majesty. Throw it away." So I cut it out, but I accidentally left in the last note. He said, "It's only a rough mix. It doesn't matter. In other words, don't bother about making a clean edit because it's only a rough mix." I said to Paul, "What shall I do with it?" "Throw it away," he replied. I'd been told never to throw anything away, so after he left, I picked it up off the floor, put about 20 seconds of red leader tape before it, and stuck it onto the end of the edit tape. The next day, down at Apple, Malcolm Davis cut a playback lacquer of the whole sequence. When Paul listened to the medley again the next day, he heard, after 20 seconds, Her Majesty is the very last piece, and he liked it. The song was never remixed, and this reveals the answer to the mystery. What happened to the last chord of Her Majesty in the final mix?
They ain't gonna make a mine. They ain't gonna make a mine.
Well, it was left in the rough initial mix, as the last note of Mean Mr. Mustard, as noted by Kurlander when he said, "I accidentally left in the last note." This also explains the crashing electric guitar chord at the beginning of Her Majesty. Besides Her Majesty, the only transition that gave them any trouble was between You Never Give Me Your Money and Sun King. They tried a couple of different solutions, but the perfect fit was not discovered on this day.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Here we see the birth of a song that was inspired by Bach's Moonlight Sonata, Because. Yoko was playing Moonlight Sonata on the piano. She was classically trained. I said, "Can you play those chords backward?" and wrote Because around them. The lyrics speak for themselves. They're clear. No bullshit. No imagery. No obscure references. This was a song that George Harrison held in very high regard. John wrote this tune. The backing is a bit like Beethoven and has 3-part harmony right throughout. I think this is possibly my favorite one on the album. The lyrics are so simple. The harmony was pretty difficult to sing. We had to really learn it. But I think that's one of the tunes that will impress most people. It's really good. And the harmonies proved the most difficult the Beatles had attempted in a very long time, as not since This Boy. And Yes It Is.
And what's more is true. Yes, it is.
Had they put in the same amount of effort to really hammer down the harmonies. They recorded multiple tracks of the vocals, 3 for each of them, for a total sum of 9.
Because the wind.
And the perfect transition between You Never Give Me Your Money and Sun King would come to Paul on this day, as he came to Abbey Road Studios with a bag of his own home-recorded tapes, a collection of bells and birds and crickets that slotted in prettily between the two songs. It was also on this day that the Moog synthesizer was brought into the studio, a huge, multi-tiered and spaghetti-wired monstrosity. They were to use it for overdubs throughout the album, beginning with Because. Engineer Nick Webb would remark, "I think the Beatles used the Moog with great subtlety. Others in a similar situation would probably have gone completely over the top with it. It's there, on the record, but not obtrusively." So it was around this point, with all of the basic tracks recorded, that the Beatles began to split up and perform overdubs on their own respective songs. Keeping at least 2 studios running at any given point. The album was near complete, and so all that was left were the final touches. On the morning of Friday, August 8th, the Beatles came together at Abbey Road, along with photographer and friend to John and Yoko, Ian Macmillan. Paul had brought along a sketch of his idea for the cover, an excruciatingly simple idea. The 4 Beatles walking across Abbey Road. The working title had been Everest, based on the type of cigarettes that engineer Geoff Emerick smoked. At some point, though, this was dropped, and somehow the Beatles fell into what would be both the easiest and most enduring solution. They spent 10 minutes shooting the album cover, and Ian only took 6 pictures of the Beatles walking across the road. We'll skip now to Friday, August 15th, which was to be a session devoted to one purpose, the orchestral overdubs for the entirety of the album. For the first time in a Beatles session, closed-circuit television was utilized to link 2 studios together, so George Martin could conduct the musicians in one studio, while Geoff Emerick and the team monitored from the other. It was a mammoth session, recalled Alan Brown. We had a large number of lines linking the studios, and we were all walking around the building with walkie-talkies, trying to communicate with each other. The orchestral overdub for The End was the most elaborate I have ever heard. It cost a lot of money. All the musicians have to be paid, fed, and watered. I screw every pound note out of it whenever I play the record. The first song to be recorded for Abbey Road, John's I Want You, ended up being one of the last tracks finished. Let's catch up real quick since it's been a while. In February, with Billy Preston, they recorded 35 takes of the song, which was edited down to a best take using 3 different versions. This is the original Trident tape. Since then, they've recorded many overdubs, but some of those overdubs were done on the original, while some have been done on a copy of the original. It's a mouthful to try and explain, but essentially, today, they have 2 extremely similar, but slightly different tapes of the same song that they need to splice together in order to have all of the elements that John desires. So for the final version, the copied tape composes the first 4 minutes and 37 seconds, while the original Trident tape covers the remaining 3 minutes and 7 seconds. It was John's decision to cut the song suddenly with a full volume slash rather than a fade out. He had and that, combined with the continually repeating guitar arpeggios, helped build an enormous wall of sound that, when suddenly cut, had a jarring and powerful effect. It was that cut that would end side 1 of the record. The rest of the day would be spent putting together the final master for the album and hammering down the running order. This was to be the last day that all 4 Beatles were in a recording studio at the same time. 2 days later, they would all attend a photo session at John and Yoko's new home at Tittenhurst Park. And then just 6 days after that, Paul and Linda would have their first child together, Mary McCartney, named after Paul's mother. A matter of weeks later, the band was essentially dead. Abbey Road is an astonishing piece of work, even outside the context of the Beatles' imminent demise. The Beatles did their best to put up a good front, but it only went so far. "You didn't want to get involved," said engineer Phil McDonald, "but people would be walking out, banging instruments down, not turning up on time and keeping the others waiting 3 or 4 hours, then blaming each other for not having rehearsed or not having played their bit right. It was very distressing." On Tuesday, September 9th, John, Paul, and George came together at Apple headquarters to discuss their future plans. Ringo wasn't there, so they brought along a tape recorder. "Ringo, you can't be here, but this is so you can hear what we're discussing," said John. They discussed plans for a new album, and with George burgeoning as a songwriter, John broached the subject of allowing George greater influence within the band. A single perhaps, and more tracks on the upcoming album. But the discussion quickly devolved into an argument, not between any specific Beatle, but between all of them at once. The following is taken from Anthony Fawcett's One Day at a Time. "Well, the thing is, Paul answered, without even looking at George, who sat a few feet away. I think that until now, until this year, our songs have been better than George's. Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours. George was quick to correct Paul. Now that's a myth, because most of the songs this year I wrote about last year or the year before anyway. Maybe now I just don't care whether you are going to like them or not. I just do them. If I didn't get a break, I wouldn't push it. I'd just forget about it. Now for the last 2 years, at any rate, I've pushed it a bit more. I know what he's saying, John said, because people have said to me you're coming through a lot stronger now than you had. I don't particularly seek acclaim, George said. That's not the thing. It's just to get out, whatever is there, to make way for whatever else is there. You know, because it's only to get 'em out. And also, I might as well make a bit of money, seeing as I'm spinning as much as the rest of you, and I don't earn as much as the rest of you. Most of my tunes, he said. I never had the Beatles backing me. Oh, come on, George, John shouted. We put a lot of work in your songs, even down to Don't Bother Me. We spent a lot of time doing all that and we grooved. I can remember the riff you were playing, and in the last 2 years there was a period where you went Indian and we weren't needed. That was only one tune, George said. On the last album, I don't think you appeared on any of my songs. I don't mind. Well, you had Eric or somebody like that, John replied, in a hurt tone of voice. There was a long pause as each Beatle seemed lost in contemplation, not wanting to admit that they were becoming individual musicians. Paul grasped at the remnants of truth and spoke slowly, almost whispering. When we get in a studio, even on the worst day, I'm still playing bass, Ringo's still drumming, and we're still there, you know? 3 days later, John Lennon would decide to leave the Beatles. The rest of that story will have to wait till next time. Thank you so very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing or checking out my older videos. I also have a Patreon you can join for $1 a month, where you can watch the videos early. If you are able to, that is a great way to help me out. Once again, thank you so much. Until next time.